start, I'd like to acknowledge that we are speaking to you. I'm speaking to you from the lands of the people of the Wurundjeri and the Bunurong, and I pay respects to elders past and present and acknowledge a continuing practice of care for country on the lands and waters on which I live, and respectfully acknowledge that sovereignty over these lands was never ceded. Today we're interviewing Mariana Martinez Balvanera, who's from Cocina CoLaboratorio, and we are speaking. So I wanted to speak to you because of the project that you're doing, and I suppose that we have been thinking a lot about how the sort of community food and new economies projects might be a way of disorganizing through our metabolism, our relationship to kind of global capitalist structures. And we have a few questions for you about, maybe it's probably a good idea just to start with a little bit of an overview about what the project is.
Perfect. Yes, perfect. Cocina CoLaboratorio is a project that brings together farmer communities, scientists, like research on ecology, agroecology, rural sociology, etc., artists and designers, which are working mostly in participatory art practices, architects, and chefs, basically around the kitchen table, to exchange knowledges about how can we think of food systems in more resilient and just ways. So this is a project that sort of started as an arts initiative by a collective called Cascoland, in which I collaborated for many years, and that gradually has been more and more collaborating with the Autonomous University of Mexico, especially the Institute for Environmental Studies, and now we are sort of like a growing collective of all kinds of people. We're a transdisciplinary collective. Some are affiliated to universities, some are, let's say, freelance, and then, of course, we have collaborators in communities, which are farmers, but also school teachers and mothers and cooks and all kinds of backgrounds. The project is based in 3 communities in Mexico. It's based in Loma Bonita, a small town at the south of the reserve, of the Montes Azules Reserve in the Lacandona, in the rainforest in Chiapas. In Santo Domingo, Tamaltepec, which is a town of around 3,000 people in the central valleys of Oaxaca, which is a completely different ecosystem. It's a Zapotec town with very strong culinary traditions. And in Xochimilco, which is basically a very ancient space for agriculture in Mexico City, which has now been completely completely eaten up by the city. So it's completely in relationship and in constant dialogue with the city. So these 3 spaces sort of allow for the project to test out, to research, to integrate, to connect different knowledge skills of the 3 sites, but also different knowledge skills of our team and the people who develop the projects within the team. And so, yeah, as I mentioned, we work especially with food. So basically, we cook with people. This is what we do. We just bring a table in the middle of the town or in a plot, and we start cooking with all kinds of people with different knowledges, as a way to exchange our visions of the food that we're cooking with, and as a way to understand that we are all basically humans. We all depend of each other and of the food that is in our table, and also to understand which pathways we can take to make our food systems more resilient. And this year we also started a project called the Biocultural Living Archives, which is a sort of a living archive of seeds, of stories, of recipes of the three communities. And then we hope that by this project we can also make links between the different communities in terms of like how can we start sharing also these knowledges or strategies for more resilient food production. So that's basically what we are doing. We are doing a lot more, but maybe I don't want to extend so much. But yeah, that's in a nutshell. Yeah.
Can I ask how many people? It sounds like a huge project. Can I just would just like to get a sense of the scale?
Yeah, I think well involved in the project, I would say there are around 60 people,
Wow.
which are from different backgrounds, affiliated to different organizations, universities, community members. But our core team is of a smaller scale, so we are yeah between 10 and 15 people.
Yeah.
Actually, and then in the communities we are working with around 30 people per community as a core, let's say, like yeah, work that we're doing. But of course, there's always people that kind of come and go, that bring in some resource, that bring in maybe like students that are also involved sometimes, or volunteers. So it depends a lot. Actually, we haven't mapped yet like the interactions, but that would be quite an interesting thing to do. Yeah.
And maybe disorganizing, so many people. It feels like
Definitely.
that must be a really good structure for thinking.
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things we've been thinking about through this project is about how we think about sharing resources. So I guess one of the questions we had was about what, and I think you have so many narratives and practices that do this, but what are the narratives that can inform radical shifts about how we think about resources and how we think about sharing those resources?
Yeah. So I think, yeah, in the project that we're doing, I think the main narratives actually are so let's put theory into action sort of thing. So we are working with a lot of facts about the urgency to shift to sustainable food systems, about soil depletion, about biodiversity loss or agrobiodiversity loss, about the resilience of how we eat and our eating habits and so on. And I think that the main narrative is like that there is sort of, we are at the moment to put certain knowledge resources also into practice, and then how we can actually make bridges to access those resources into the locations that most needed, let's say, no? So the university might be working like in a structure where it produces work for university, but then what happens when those resources, those knowledges don't reach actually the places where it should be put in practice, no? So that's what we are trying to do, and that's why, for example, the word transdisciplinary is quite important in the project, although it comes from academia. But just thinking about, okay, what does transdisciplinary mean? And I think as a concept or like as a narrative is quite interesting, because it just means that it doesn't really matter what discipline you are, and what kind of resources you have in your own discipline, but the idea is that you have to kind of mix and match it, and then in the practice find a way to actually work together. No, so this is something that we are trying to find out. It's not I think it's not easy, but um, once we are all working on more like collective, for example, building projects on your, or you're cooking, you're basically like embodying this way to relate to each other, beyond, let's say, the more like intellectual terms. Then it becomes, it just visualizes more, and it flows more, no?
Yeah.
And also, I think, like the narratives we also want to portray are about, for example, yeah, why food is so important in a way, no? Like, food or seeds, or they're like small, let's say, or not small, but more tangible objects, or tangible things you can hold, or you can eat, or you can smell, which in a way also tell you about the symbiotic relationships we have with other species, with our soil, with our cosmovisions, no? So yeah, I think that's a really nice way to also start um, this sharing process, no? And acknowledging those relationships that we have amongst each other. Yeah.
Yeah.
When we talk about the narratives, you're already speaking a lot to the way that we are kind of interdependent on each other, not just human to human, but also our relationship to, different kinds of resources and entities and beings, right? And it was also interesting that you were sort of like started out by also saying that you might have to like map all of these relationships in a way, because there might be a core, but then, I think in a way in some of our practices as well, what's interesting is that that core is not just always something that's stable, but, it's constantly changing, our relationships change. So maybe, in what way would you think then about this kind of interdependence as opposed to the autonomy in a way, and also how that maybe kind of influences the way that your community is also being designed or thought about, just your own relationship with each other, if there's something that you kind of have written down as some that's understood between different community members, or is it just a lot more organic?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it varies. As I said, like it's I really like how you described that, that relationships are always shifting, and that, of course, yeah, our team, because it's composed of so many people that kind of come and go and transit and bring in some ideas, and then are in their own projects, and then, like, I think that flow of people in a way has made it quite natural in how we kind of organize our work. It is also quite difficult because it means that we don't have a methodology for our collaboration, and sometimes because it's so transdisciplinary, it can lead to also misunderstandings, or kind of not different ways of perceiving the work that you're doing, or how we should be organizing, or who is going to take the decisions, or how are we going to take decisions, and who is doing the more sort of back end work, who is putting ideas into the table, no, and which what methodologies, what do we want to actually portray or like enable throughout our collective practices. And I think this is something that we've been faced with many times, and these questions with different people, and with not only like the core members, but with other people that are coming through the project. Even when we are working in community, this is also something that we discuss a lot. Like even, for example, with the organization of the community, for like the time that we are there, how we organize our work there, how the community organizes itself after we are not there, no? How do they keep up with the work? How do we communicate afterwards? And I think it has been quite organic because we still don't have a methodology for it. We have tried a few, I think, or like we've tried like, okay, different sort of organizing workshops, but I think that we are in the making of our own methodology, and I think that's quite beautiful. And this is something that you have to also always tell people that are coming into the project, like, okay, welcome to the chaos.
Exactly.
We are finding sense in the chaos, no, like somehow. And I think that the most beautiful moments, actually, which I was talking about maybe before, are the moments that are going very organically, no? Like, okay, suddenly we all organize very kind of spontaneously and then start, I don't know, everybody's carrying one thing and then we set up a kitchen and then we start cooking and then things start flowing, then we start connecting. And then by the end of the day, everybody has like a very satisfactory feeling, like, oh, we did something and we organized, and of course we did some like prep, but actually what it's a bit like when ants kind of organize themselves, no? Like when there's like an ant nest and then things are moved up, steered up a little bit, and then ants start to kind of run in different ways, paths, but then they start organizing themselves again. And I kind of feel that that's that's a bit the movement, like when you feel it when things start happening like that. Or being on the streets doing an action, no? So I think like the action part really helps for the group to kind of consolidate its common vision, no? Because it is based on experience. Whereas I find it more frustrating sometimes when we are kind of spending many hours trying to define methodologies for collective endeavor, no? And I think it is super important because you need the action to then think about, okay, we could have organized this better, or we are doing this very well, this works, and I really like how we had synergies here, and I actually in this other part we need more communication, no? So I think these small actions can mean a lot to this group, and then whoever kind of comes into the collective actions suddenly kind of get the grip of, okay, now I get a little bit about what is this project, no? And I think, yeah, the it is still a it is still hard to kind of shift from the individual way of working, no, of like having your own methodology or having your own for example, we're working a lot with researchers, or even in cultural projects, no, artists or designers. We're always thinking about, okay, which are my motivations and which are my expectations of this project, and how can I lead, let's say, this process to get my objectives, no? But I think that we have to kind of go beyond that and then start thinking much more about, okay, how can we actually do meaningful collaborations, no? And sometimes it's we have to test out which things we have to leave behind from, let's say, our individual expectations, which things we can also bring into the table, and that will also enhance sort of like the collective work, and which things we have to think anew, no, and which things which with other skills we need to develop to to actually enhance a collective vision, no?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's really important to talk about when it doesn't work as well. Like it's just as, you know, very success orientated, but I think actually a lot of the time group working and collective working can have lots of little mini failures as well as, you know, as well as lovely times, and that's actually quite nice to hear about. I think it's really good to hear about it.
I think especially if you are thinking about sort of new ways of collaboration or like empathic systems of care and so on, you always have to think, okay, what went wrong in this part? Who didn't feel okay with it? Were we all comfortable? Yes or no? And how can we make that better for the next time? Because it's not something that, you read off a book and then you just put it in practice. I think in practice is always the most difficult part. It is super beautiful and it's super powerful, but it is still challenging. So just acknowledge that it will not be perfect all the time. No, I think we always like to portray collectivity as something very, bubbly and nice and beautiful, and it is, of course, but it is also challenging our perceptions of individualism, no, of like selfishness, which are imposed by our current system. So, okay, how can we challenge that? And it's not an easy transition, of course.
No, and I think that comes to this next question, which we have about the sort of normative practices of capitalism. And I think we were thinking about economies in some ways, but I think it's also to do with working together. It's and I think you've already spoken about this a little bit, but maybe we could think about it in terms of the relationships not within your collaboration, but the relationships that are attendant outside the kind of the way that the projects that you work on expand imaginaries beyond the project, and what those imaginaries might be like, and also how do you get a sense of them?
I think that, okay, for sure that the project sort of in its concept as well and how we build it, in a way it is resisting these normative practices, no, of our current system. I guess it is not outspokenly doing so. Like I don't think we ever like I don't know if in our text there is ever like something about anti-capitalism, or like we are not maybe outspokenly political in that sense, yet the practices that we enable within the project, let's say the projects we develop, the practices of, for example, collective cooking or like collective gardening, or we are all putting one part of ourselves or resources into something collective. It really just like what we want to do with that is portray other ways of collaborating or doing things together, no, or like breaking barriers between academics and farmers, for example. No, breaking barriers between, okay, I need this information, and then what will happen with that information. So actually putting things in practice, acknowledging also very much the practices of resistance of indigenous communities or non-indigenous communities also, because in Chiapas they're not indigenous, but of farmer communities. Okay, really acknowledging and giving voice also to those kind of resilience practices, which in a way are not embedded in capitalism. I think the people from the city are more like inclined to enact these kind of practices. But then we are also learning a lot about different ways of seeing the world, of different ways of organizing. No, in Oaxaca, for example, the community that we work on is a Zapotec indigenous community, and they are governed by their own practices. No, so the government actually, like the democratic system, doesn't really is not so relevant there. So, for example, they already have a lot of communal practices of self-organization. No, so I think what we can do with the project in that sense is like kind of put those practices in a pedestal, communicate the essence of this kind of collective endeavors, of this collective knowledge, of breaking barriers between yeah
disciplines.
Yeah, exactly. And and um, and what we hope that exactly this project also transmits beyond what we are actually doing on site is those ideas, no, like how those ideas of what can we do together, which is very simple, but in a way that connects us as humans. And it doesn't matter if we are a scientist or a farmer or we have a different cosmovision. So hopefully, yeah, by what we are doing and our communication and by talking about this project, we are somehow, yeah, inspiring to create these networks, no?
In seeds and seed sharing, there's a kind of inherently like anti-capitalist is a phrase that comes from, I lived in England for a long time, and last year the government made teaching anti-capitalism in schools, the Tory government in the UK made teaching anti-capitalism in schools like illegal. And so there's this kind of desire to speak about anti-capitalism openly from, if in the UK, because it's important to make it not taboo and make it something that we could think about, like we need to be able to think about it. And I think a lot of people are thinking about it after COVID anyway.
Yeah, definitely, exactly.
Or during COVID still. So I think the seed is such an interesting sort of site for resistance, and we've spoken about this before. I wondered if you just might talk a little bit about the way seed sharing and the kind of practices of seed sharing that you're either working on or observing or amplifying.
I think it also it refers to what I was saying about these community practices that are already existing and that we kind of want to also put in a pedestal, because I mean, seed sharing and keeping is already, it is a practice that is embedded and is always, it's like, it's a daily life activity, let's say, in these communities, no? And I think the initiative that we did specifically was more about kind of putting those seed sharing practices into the open and kind of visualizing how and celebrating also how they are so important to the community. And what we did through this Biocultural Living Archive, I think had to do beyond sort of the seed sharing part, more about like the seed sharing also is of course of seeds and keeping the seeds, but also of the knowledges that are associated with each seed and the stories of the seeds and where they come from, for example, and who gave you this seed, and how do you keep it, how do you take care of it. And then I think like just matching seeds and stories, and then sharing those seeds and stories between the different people in the community, really did celebrate that idea that of like of a collective like resistance also to for example GMOs or other seeds that are arriving to the community, no? Because that's also a problem, I think, well, everywhere in the world, but at least in Mexico for corn, that's like our main theme, no? How do we create stronger networks of seed sharing or seed keeping to resist genetically modified corn and not lose all the varieties of corn that we have. So we also found like amazing stories about families that have modified their corns through generations, for example, to make red red corn or like a variety of different color corn and so on, and kind of putting those those stories into the open and visualizing the variety of stories of seeds of where they come from. It's a beautiful exercise in recognizing those practices, beyond the house.
Yeah, the kind of like biocultural diversity that needs to be celebrated in all of our places. I keep thinking these practices are useful everywhere. You know,
Exactly. And of course, I mean, we live in cities, and we get our products from the market or the supermarket, and we might have also a place where we grow our own food. But I think, exactly, learning from these kind of practices also makes us, gives us tools as well. It kind of like on the other side, because I think that many projects are like, okay, let's empower communities. But I think it's more like empowering also people that are living in cities to follow those practices, to actually implement those. And how can we do that in our own context? How can we learn from that? No?
Yeah, absolutely. I always think that we have such a kind of rural urban separation. Like we don't think in urban areas about the kind of, I mean, our digestive systems are constantly interacting with rural economies and ecologies, and yet we're really distant from them. And the more that we can kind of connect that external sort of part of our digestion that is happening, our external metabolisms, then the more that we can start to think, oh, well, actually there's different ways of sustaining myself, even in little ways, even in like very small, very slight gestures towards a different kind of independence or an interdependence that's more local.
Definitely.
Sorry, I actually had a question that was also related to what we were talking about in terms of resisting normative practices. So I was just curious to know, especially because it's it involves like cooking, eating. You talked initially about like setting up a table and everyone kind of comes together, and in my context growing up in India, it's very gendered, right? Like gendered roles when it comes to the kitchen. It's and especially there's a lot of conservatism around like obviously with women who kind of have to make certain foods, and then even now in towns and in villages, women when they're on their menstrual cycle cannot enter the kitchen, cannot touch certain foods because it's supposed to like spoil the food if they touch it, because, and these things are still sort of practiced. And I kind of wondered maybe if you could speak also a little bit to what happens in those little micro relationships, because I know that we kind of talk about community and collaboration in terms of disciplines. Like of course there would be like the farmer and the academic, but then we're also just in our own lives we have a certain relationship to food and eating and cooking. So do those things kind of come up in the way that you're thinking about community? I mean, or has that played out somewhere, and have you had conversations around it? Because it would be interesting to know if something was resisted in that space.
No, definitely. I think that's a very good question, because it is a theme that we are always sort of encountered with. Of course, cooking and celebrating, and it's coming together. But also, as you say, as you mentioned, it is also very gendered, and in Mexico it is still very gendered. I'm not sure, like maybe not to a point of what, like some cases that you're mentioning, but for example, I mean, women are the are usually the ones who are cooking, of taking care of the family. Men usually do not cook, and like if you see a man in some places cooking, then he will be called homosexual,
or chef.
Yeah, exactly. Or a chef, which is
exactly.
So exactly, and then also those like power dynamics between who is a chef and who is a traditional cook, for example, no?
Yeah.
Because women from indigenous communities are traditional cooks, but also a guy that actually learned from that woman how to cook and then went to a high-end restaurant is called a chef, no? So there are so many power relations between in the kitchen as well, and we have encountered moments, no, like when we are cooking, suddenly depends where and when, but mostly, for example, in Chiapas or in Oaxaca, those which are spaces with more rural spaces. So, for example, in comparison to Xochimilco, which is like the more urban space. But yeah, we've had men saying like, no, I do not touch food because it tasted bad, or no, I'm not going to do this because what do you think I am, a woman? No, and you have to deal with those situations also because you have a set of beliefs that in a way you also don't want to impose, no, into the community. But then you can also maybe like turn a little bit the rules or the activities. So, for example, how we deal with this sometimes is that, yeah, of course, we have other men from our team that are cooking. So, in a way, also setting some sort of example. And then there are kids or other men that might join to cook. Or we have cooking with fire, which is also fire and men are also very like primarily connected in a way, right? But it is a question. It is a question, and also because there is so much expectation in the labor of women in the kitchen, no? Um, so I think we are still. I mean, the things are there and the questions are there, and we have observed like some let's say um, relations happening in there. And we are still thinking, okay, what kind of mechanisms can we also use or design so that it yeah, these activities are maybe more inclusive or don't reproduce these power dynamics, no? So yeah, as I said, we have tried a few things. Of course, if the activities are and the program is about farming, then you have all the men with you. But in the it's usually in the eating part where men are like, "Yay, I love this."
It's where I'm happiest.
Yeah.
No, it is an interesting thing, definitely. No, and
Mm.
yeah, also in our experience, for example, I think for like farming, yeah, in like an agricultural field, that's more men that take care of those spaces, whereas sort of small scale farming or like kitchen gardens, what we call solares, which are like the sort of the family garden in the backyard of the houses, those are taken care by women. So there is also roles into, okay, what are women planting and like taking care of, and what are men planting and taking care of, and how does that relate to each other, no? And we did a nice exercise video with a family of only women, and they were talking about how for them their link to nature was through their mother and their grandmother, because they were the ones who showed them how to take care of their solares, of the herbs, of the tomatoes, of the cucumbers that they're gardening in their backyard. No, and I thought that was such a powerful thing because usually those narratives don't get out there so much, and they're actually not so recognized by communities. No, so this is more like a sort of like behind the door kind of practice.
Yeah.
So yeah, talking about those acts of resistance from women also is also super beautiful.
I would love to just ask one more question before. I know that what you were thinking about is also working with a piece of land and thinking about a kind of long-term ecological restoration of the land. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that and what kind of politics that involves?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so exactly our long-term vision is to, well, now we are working in within community plots. So of course for the three sites it's quite different, but I'm going to talk about the Chiapas case study because that's where I am, let's say, more involved for more time. So the idea is to, in this plot, we have already made um, sort of a kitchen edible garden there. And we have started to design a food forest in this space, which will become sort of an experimental agroforestry parcel. So before kind of going through that process, the past years we have been more like mapping with the community the types of uh, species, plants, and what they are used for, which ones are significant, which are not, how do we take care of those plants, and etc. And like also, and what with that, now we are starting a process of co-designing of this food forest.
Wow.
Also, we planted like a living seed archive, so the idea is also to extend that into the plot. We want to start building a kitchen, so like a lab kitchen for processing the foods that are coming from the food forest and from this kitchen garden. And the idea is that kind of this becomes a sort of center for experimentation and knowledge exchange and sort of collective exchange practices, and that later on that can be also translated into kind of individual plots of members of the communities, no? And already there's like quite a few people who are quite excited about the idea of, okay, first experimenting there and then translating that into their own plot. So that's
That's
now
really
we are working on that. And of course this I think right now what we are doing is also um, creating agreements with the communities, working on a common vision. How do we envision this in the future? I think for some people this is very significant, for others it's not so much. So it's just like also respecting the different views of the project and the different impacts. And of course, a lot of fund sourcing to develop this project and also to develop a program that can be much more constant. So if we, for example, have this food forest and a kitchen, we would like to have residents for, well, like we've done residencies, but in a more like yeah, not so structured way. So there, like every time we are working on site, there's different people coming in with different knowledges and resources. But I think we want to establish a program which is much more constant and that kind of responds also to the needs and interests of the communities, depending on what we're working on. So, for example, conserves and fermentation has been a really big theme in the community. So we could, for example, invite someone that is working on those kind of skills to, for example, develop a project there. And agroforestry or like soil management or pest control, like that's also like all these little things that, I mean, not little, actually, they're quite big. but that need a like a very specific set of skills, no? So yeah, so now we're working on that, and we are working on the resources to actually program this space for long term, and hopefully we are getting some resources to do that for the next 5 years. And then the idea is to also kind of translate the concept to Oaxaca and to Xochimilco, although like there are very different organizations there. But in Xochimilco, we are building a kitchen as well. We are working already with some organizations that have been working in Xochimilco for many, many years, and so on. So yeah, so the idea is a bit like establishing long-term spaces and programs so that we can have sort of like rotating visitors, and hopefully, yeah, that will develop into projects that actually are impactful in the communities, no? So both like regenerating land, but also maybe creating products for in the community that can also become a sort of like economical income, or creating collaborative economies within the communities and around, no? So yeah, that's a little bit.
That's great. That kind of touches on the last thing I was going to ask about, kind of community economy and whether that sort of figures in your way of thinking.
Yeah.
That is, thank you.
Yeah, no. Thank you.